On Christmas Eve of 1945, in the quiet town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, 12 members of the Sodder family went to sleep under a roof they had known for years. The house, wooden and warm, was filled with holiday laughter, with 9 of the 10 children finally drifting off after opening a few small gifts. George and Jenny Sodder, the parents, turned off the lights just before midnight. Snow was beginning to fall. The fire in the hearth was still glowing. It was a typical Christmas night, until it wasn't. By dawn, the house was gone. Reduced to smoldering embers, its wooden frame collapsed into itself. 5 of the Sodder children were missing. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. They were never found. Not in the ash. Not anywhere. No footprints. No remains. No explanation. The official story said the fire took them, but for the Sodder parents, the evidence never added up, and the deeper you look into this story, the more disturbing it becomes. George Sodder wasn't born a Sodder. He came to America from Tula, Italy, as a teenager, leaving behind a past he rarely spoke about. Ambitious and strong-willed, he built a trucking business from scratch in West Virginia and became well known in Fayetteville. Some admired him, others not so much. He was outspoken, especially about Mussolini, and in a small town with a strong Italian immigrant population, those views didn't go unnoticed. Jenny Sodder, his wife, was soft-spoken but sharp. Together they raised 10 children in a modest home built with care. By 1945, their oldest son was away in the military. The rest, ranging in age from 5 to 23, filled the house with constant noise and warmth. The Sodders were considered a proud, hard-working family, stable, respected, but under that surface were signs. Strange phone calls. A man who came to the house offering to install wiring, warning that this place is going to go up in smoke. Conversations that seemed harmless, until the night everything burned. The house on Route 16 was filled with laughter that night. Jenny had let the children open one gift early, just one, and they clutched their toys with sleepy excitement. Martha and Jenny Jr. played near the tree while little Betty sat curled up by the fire. Maurice and Louis begged to stay up past their bedtime, promising to turn off the lights and close the curtains themselves. Jenny agreed, as long as they didn't forget to feed the cows and bring in the chickens. At 10:00 p.m., she took young Sylvia to bed. George was already asleep. The rest of the children, 5 of them, remained downstairs, playing quietly. By all accounts, it was a peaceful, ordinary Christmas Eve. But around midnight, the phone rang. Jenny answered. A woman's voice asked for someone Jenny didn't know. Laughter echoed in the background. Jenny told her she had the wrong number, but the woman laughed again before hanging up. Odd. When Jenny returned to bed, she noticed the lights were still on, the curtains still open. The children were nowhere to be seen. She turned everything off, assumed they had gone up to the attic to sleep, and went back to bed. It was sometime around 1:00 a.m. when Jenny woke to a loud thud, like something hitting the roof, and then the distinct sound of something rolling. For a moment, she froze, then silence. Thinking it might have been snow or ice, she drifted back to sleep. But just minutes later, the smell of smoke reached her nose. When she opened her eyes again, it was thick in the room. She leapt from bed and ran to George, yelling for the children. Flames were already licking up the walls of the downstairs living room. The stairwell was filled with smoke. George grabbed a water barrel from outside, but it was frozen solid. The family scattered. 4 of the children were quickly found outside in the yard, barefoot and coughing, but the other 5, the ones who had stayed up to play, were gone. George tried to get to them. He broke a window, slicing his arm open. He climbed the stairs, but the smoke pushed him back. He tried the ladder, only to find it missing. The truck, frozen and wouldn't start. Every path to the children, blocked. Outside, the night was frigid, the snow now falling harder. Neighbors saw the glow from miles away and began to gather, but there was little anyone could do. The phone lines were dead. A driver passing by sped into town to alert the fire department, but response was slow. The war had left Fayetteville's crew short-handed. Only one firefighter knew how to operate the truck. It took hours for help to arrive. By the time the fire was out, the Sodder home was nothing but smoking rubble. George clawed through the ashes with his bare hands. cutting through debris, searching for any sign of his children. Bones, teeth, anything. But there was nothing. Not a trace. Not a single fragment of remains. And yet the fire hadn't burned long or hot enough to completely cremate 5 bodies. People whispered explanations. Maybe the children had been incinerated beyond recognition. Maybe the blaze had destroyed all evidence. But George and Jenny didn't buy it. Something was wrong. Deeply, undeniably wrong. By sunrise, the town buzzed with rumors. Some offered condolences. Others asked quiet, uncomfortable questions. Why hadn't the children screamed? Why no remains? Why had every path to rescue been blocked? Frozen truck engines, a missing ladder, a phone line cut. The local fire chief, F.J. Morris, arrived later that day. The investigation was rushed, casual. He claimed to have found a few bones, possibly from the children, but couldn't produce them. Days later, he changed his story. Said he'd buried the pieces in a box without notifying anyone. A state inspector declared the fire electrical, caused by faulty wiring. But George knew that couldn't be true. He had recently rewired the entire home and passed inspection. And besides, the Christmas lights had stayed on during the early part of the fire. How could faulty wiring do that? Despite everything, the official conclusion came quickly. The 5 Sodder children had died in the fire. No further investigation was needed, they said. George couldn't stop digging. For days after the fire, he returned to the ashes with a shovel in his bare hands. Jenny, meanwhile, stayed up late into the night researching house fires. She read medical textbooks, forensic manuals, anything that could explain how 5 bodies could vanish so completely. But the more she read, the more impossible it seemed. They began to collect testimonies. A telephone repairman told them their line hadn't burned in the fire. It had been cut. A witness reported seeing a man stealing something from the property the night before. Others claimed they saw figures watching the house from the road in the days leading up to Christmas. George poured a truckload of dirt over the remains to preserve the site, hoping for a real investigation. None came. Instead, people began to whisper that George and Jenny were in denial, that they were grieving parents unable to accept the truth. But the Sodders believed something else entirely. Their children hadn't died in the fire. They had been taken. Soon, stories began to surface. One woman, watching the fire from the road, swore she saw several figures moving near the house, far from the flames. Another, who claimed to be a neighbor, said she saw the children peering from a passing car window in the early hours of the morning, long before the fire trucks ever arrived. Then came the waitress. Working at a diner 50 miles away, she told investigators she'd seen 4 of the Sodder children with 2 unknown adults, both Italian, she believed. The adults ordered food for the children but refused to let them speak. The kids looked dazed, quiet, afraid. George and Jenny followed every lead. They posted flyers, placed newspaper ads, offered $5,000 for information, a small fortune at the time, and they waited for anything. A phone call, a tip, a sign. What they got was something far stranger. It came in the mail. In 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny received a plain envelope, postmarked from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph. A man in his 20s, dark hair, strong features. No return address, no explanation. But on the back of the photo, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were these words: Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Ill boys, A90132 or 35. Louis was one of the 5 children who'd vanished in the fire, and the man in the photo, he looked just like an older version of him. The Sodders were shaken. They hired a private investigator who traveled to Kentucky and was never heard from again. No report, no follow-up, just silence. This was no longer just grief. This was something else, something calculated, something dark. If Louis didn't die in that fire, then where had he been for 2 decades? And who sent the photo? After the photograph, George became obsessed. He built a billboard on the side of Route 16. Huge reward, what happened to the Sodder children, with their names, faces, and the growing list of strange facts surrounding the case. Drivers from all over stopped to read it. Some left flowers. Others sent letters. A few sent warnings. George and Jenny began to suspect something much bigger. that their children hadn't just been kidnapped, but possibly taken by a group, organized, hidden, and dangerous. They revisited every clue. The man who'd visited weeks before the fire, warning the house would go up in smoke. The insurance salesman who had threatened George when he refused a policy. The rumors that circulated in the Italian immigrant community. Some whispered about a vendetta, others about child trafficking rings with ties that reached beyond West Virginia. To outsiders, it sounded like desperation. To George and Jenny, it sounded like the truth. The more the Sodders investigated, the stranger things became. Records went missing. People changed their stories. Officials who once seemed sympathetic suddenly turned distant. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, who originally claimed to find bone fragments, admitted later he had fabricated that part to give the family closure. Even the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental had been handpicked by a man who had openly feuded with George Sodder. Was it just small-town dysfunction, or something more deliberate? There were whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that someone in local government had ties to underground adoption networks, that the children had been sold, not burned, that the fire was staged to erase them from their old life. Jenny kept the photo of Louis on the mantel next to their children's portraits. She never gave up. She never stopped hoping. George died in 1969, still looking. Sylvia Sodder was just 2 years old when the fire tore through her home. She remembers nothing of that night, only the stories, the photographs, and the pain etched into her mother's face every time the subject came up. As she grew older, she became the quiet keeper of the family mystery. While others moved on, Sylvia dug in. She read every article, studied every theory, collected documents, letters, witness statements. Unlike the rest of the town, she didn't want the story to fade. She wanted answers. By the 2000s, she became the last surviving Sodder sibling still actively searching. She believed her siblings had been taken. She believed the photo was real. And she believed someone, somewhere, knew the truth. The billboard remained standing until 1989, faded, weather-worn, but unmoved, just like Sylvia. Decades passed, but the Sodder mystery never faded completely. Then came the internet. Reddit threads dissected every photo, every statement. Amateur investigators mapped out timelines, cross-referenced birth records, and even used facial recognition software to analyze the Louis photo. YouTube channels broke the story down frame by frame. Podcasts speculated on connections to Cold War espionage, underground child trafficking, and even witness protection programs gone wrong. The story had transformed. No longer just a local tragedy, it was now a digital cold case. But for all the noise, no hard evidence ever emerged. No new photo, no DNA match, no confession. Just questions, and a growing audience unwilling to let it go. Time has a way of softening sharp edges. Facts become secondhand stories. Memories warp. People move on. Not because they've found peace, but because life demands it. Most of the people connected to the Sodder case are long gone. Chief Morris, the waitress, the neighbors. Even Jenny, who passed in 1989. She died with the photo of Louis still on her mantle. She never stopped believing he was out there. Never once accepted the ashes as truth. The land where the house once stood remains empty. Weeds creep over what's left of the foundation. A few scorched stones lie buried beneath brush. Sometimes hikers or curious travelers stop, unaware they're standing on top of one of America's deepest unresolved tragedies. Sylvia knows. She visits the land every year on Christmas Eve. She brings no flowers, no candles, just silence. She walks the perimeter, as if retracing the walls of a home that once held 10 children. Her memories of that night are vague, but the hole it left behind has shape, weight, and voice. And every year she leaves with the same question. How could 5 children vanish into fire without a single trace? 5 children went to sleep on Christmas Eve, 1945. They were never seen again. No remains, no graves, no goodbyes, just a fire. And a silence that settled over Fayetteville like fog, never quite lifting. What began as a tragedy grew into something stranger, something unfinished, a mystery that folded itself into every photo frame left on Jenny's mantle. Every page Sylvia reread in her collection of yellowed clippings. Some believe the truth was buried that night, either in the ashes or in the silence of those who knew more than they said. Others are certain the children lived on, under new names, in places far from West Virginia, too young to remember, or too scared to speak. The photo from Kentucky still haunts Sylvia. She doesn't know if it's Lewis, but she keeps it in a drawer, worn from the time she's pulled it out, stared, and searched for something familiar in the eyes. There are no answers, but there's one certainty. Some mysteries do not die. They wait, quietly, patiently. So what do you believe? Did the Sodder children die in that fire? Or did someone, somewhere, make sure they vanished forever? Sylvia once told a reporter that her family never truly celebrated Christmas again. They went through the motions, lights, gifts, dinner, but it always felt hollow, as if the season had been stolen from them, as if the snow that used to feel magical now carried the weight of memory. She still remembers how her mother would sit by the window every Christmas Eve, watching the dark woods beyond their property, waiting, hoping, listening for a knock that never came. After Jenny passed, Sylvia took over the rituals. Every December, she rereads the case files, revisits letters, scans message boards. She doesn't post. She doesn't engage. She just watches. Sometimes people send theories. Sometimes photos. Sometimes cruel jokes. But every now and then, something feels real. A man in Montana who swore he met someone named Maurice who didn't know his real birthday. A woman in New Jersey who said she remembered a sister named Betty, but her parents insisted she was an only child. They're always vague, always unverifiable, but Sylvia reads them all, because one of them, just one, might be true. A few years ago, Sylvia received a letter postmarked from Ontario. No return address, just a typed note and a photocopy of a hospital record from 1953. The document listed a patient named Lewis S., admitted for a minor injury, burns on his forearms. The age and birth year matched. The document was real. She verified the hospital's existence, but there was no follow-up, no discharge papers, no next of kin listed. She showed it to law enforcement. They shrugged. To them, it was nothing. To her, it was a door. Sylvia made phone calls, spoke to archivists, even hired someone to visit the hospital's former site, now a parking garage. Records were gone. The case went cold, again, but it left a crack. And sometimes, that's enough. She wonders, if that was Lewis, what happened after he left the hospital? Was he alone? Was he being watched? Did he know who he was? She sometimes imagines him waking up in a hospital bed, confused. Maybe he didn't remember Christmas Eve. Maybe someone made sure he didn't. The fire may have taken her home, but it didn't erase her need to know. Today, the Sodder case lives on in places Jenny and George never could have imagined. Forums, podcasts, TikTok breakdowns, cold case YouTube channels with millions of views. Teenagers with no connection to West Virginia dissect crime scene photos and question timelines. AI facial recognition tools compare the 1968 Lewis photo to school yearbooks and missing persons registries. It's no longer just a family mystery. It's become public domain, an internet ritual. Every year, near Christmas, the Reddit threads come alive again. New theories, old frustrations. Someone always asks, why don't they just dig up the site again? As if the answer might finally be buried beneath a few inches of dirt and silence. Sylvia watches, silently. She's seen wild claims, alien abductions, FBI cover-ups, even satanic cults. But she's also seen patterns. Questions she once asked alone now echoed by thousands. And while most see it as unsolvable, Sylvia sees something else. Persistence. The kind that runs in blood, the kind that doesn't die in smoke. Sometimes Sylvia wonders if she was supposed to forget. She was just 2 years old when the fire happened. Old enough to breathe smoke, too young to form memory. People told her she was lucky, that she was spared, but she never felt lucky, not once. She carries a strange guilt, not for surviving, but for not remembering. She has no clear image of her siblings' faces beyond photographs, no memory of their voices, their laughter, and yet their absence has shaped every corner of her life. She never had children of her own, never married. Some say it was grief, others think she was obsessed. but she doesn't see it that way. She says remembering isn't obsession, it's responsibility, because if she lets go, the case dies with her. Every file she keeps, every note she jots down in her old spiral notebooks, it's not just evidence, it's resistance. Against time, against forgetting, against the quiet rewriting of truth. And even now, with her hair gone white and her hands trembling, she says, I still see them. Not clearly, but I feel when they're near. In the quiet hours of the night, Sylvia sometimes questions the worth of it all. What if they did die in that fire? What if every photograph, every clue, every strange letter was nothing more than grief grasping at shadows? It would be easier to believe that, to close the notebooks, pack away the flyers, throw out the photo, but she can't. Not because she's sure they lived, but because she's never been sure they didn't. Doubt can be louder than belief. It hums in the background, sharp as static. And for Sylvia, silence has always been the loudest clue. She's seen how people forget, how time repaints the past with softer colors, how neighbors who once swore the children escaped now tell reporters they probably died, how stories erode, how fire can burn facts as easily as wood. So she keeps going, not for justice, not even for answers, but to make sure the question doesn't vanish. Because if one day someone somewhere remembers something, she'll be here, waiting. There's a tree near the edge of the Sodder property, gnarled, half dead, but still rooted. Sylvia says it wasn't there the night of the fire. It grew afterward, crooked and fast, as if something buried beneath had tried to push its way back into the world. Every winter, its bark peels more. Locals say lightning hit it once, but Sylvia isn't sure. She just knows that no matter the season, birds never land on its branches. It stands alone. Some people call it superstition, but to Sylvia, that tree feels like a scar, not visible from the road, only noticeable if you walk the land slowly, knowing what to look for. She sometimes sits beneath it, not speaking. She imagines what it might have witnessed, what it might remember if trees could dream. There's a kind of presence there, not loud, not visible, but heavy, like breath behind your shoulder, like names whispered in smoke, and in that silence, she tells them, I didn't forget you. I never will. There are moments when Sylvia dreams of them, not as ghosts, but as children, running barefoot through the snow, laughing, calling for her. She wakes with tears in her eyes and a strange warmth in her chest, like someone had just whispered her name and vanished. She doesn't believe in hauntings, but she believes in presence. And memory, she says, is its own kind of haunting. Sometimes she wonders if her siblings grew up somewhere, if they lived full lives under false names, if they had children of their own who were told a different story. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they were made to forget. But if even one of them remembers, if even one still wonders what happened that night in West Virginia, then Sylvia wants this story to reach them. Not for reunion, not even for closure, but so they know. Someone kept looking. Someone refused to let the fire be the end. Because silence isn't always peace, and vanishing isn't always death. There's a difference between closure and quiet. Sylvia knows that now. She used to chase answers like they were finish lines, thinking one photograph, one name, one buried record would end the ache. But time doesn't wrap things up with neat bows. It leaves them open, raw, echoing. She stopped expecting resolution, but she never stopped noticing patterns. A face in a newspaper, a story too similar in another state, a government file with just enough redactions to make her wonder. People say, it's been too long, but Sylvia knows time doesn't erase truth. It just buries it deeper. And sometimes, if you dig long enough, it shifts. She doesn't know what she's hoping to find anymore, only that the moment she stops looking, the world might finally let the story die. And that, more than anything, is what she refuses to let happen. 3 years ago, Sylvia received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a torn page from a 1955 city directory in Charleston, South Carolina. 2 names were underlined in red, Maurice Sodder and Betty Sodder. No context, no message, just the page. It looked old. The ink had faded. The paper had yellowed and cracked at the edges, but it was real. She stared at it for hours. She thought maybe it was a prank, some internet sleuth trying to be clever, but something about the handwriting, the pressure of the underlines. It felt urgent. She contacted the local archives. They found no record of those names ever being registered. She searched voter logs, census data, employment records. Nothing. But she couldn't throw the page away. It sits now in her filing cabinet between photographs and police reports. Just another artifact in a collection of almosts. She doesn't know who sent it, but someone wanted her to see it, and that means someone else out there still remembers. The page haunted her. So that spring, Sylvia booked a bus ticket to Charleston, not because she believed she'd find them there, but because she had to see the place with her own eyes, to walk the streets where their names had once been printed, even if only in ink and error. She stayed at a budget motel near King Street. The air smelled of salt and old brick. Every morning she walked downtown with the page folded in her pocket, asking shopkeepers, librarians, old-timers if the names meant anything. Most said no. A few tilted their heads. One woman, maybe in her 90s, paused when Sylvia mentioned Maurice. "Had a boy come through here, round 56 or 57, she said. Didn't talk much. Looked lost. Had a burn on his hand. Said he didn't know his last name." Sylvia's heart stopped, but the woman's memory faded as quickly as it had flickered. "Maybe I'm mixing him up with someone else," she added. "It's been a long time." That night, Sylvia sat on a bench by the harbor, staring at the water. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just listened. Because sometimes the past doesn't shout. It whispers. On the ride back from Charleston, Sylvia sat by the window, watching towns blur into trees. She didn't find proof. No photos, no names, no graves. Just a sentence from a woman who maybe remembered, or maybe imagined. But something had shifted. She realized her search wasn't just for her siblings anymore. It was for herself, for the child who grew up in a house half full, with birthdays that always felt too quiet, for the woman who built her identity around a question no one else wanted to ask. For decades, she thought the answer would bring peace. Now she understands. The search is the peace, because it means she hasn't let go, because it means the story isn't buried, even if the trail is cold. Outside, a stretch of pine trees reminded her of the ones behind the old house. For a moment, she imagined 5 small shadows darting between trunks, laughing, unbothered by time. Maybe they were gone, or maybe, just maybe, they were never meant to be found. Sylvia's living room doesn't look like a home. It looks like an archive, a shrine, a question stretched across decades. On one wall, dozens of black and white photographs hang in mismatched frames. The children at school, on the porch, at the dinner table. Some are copies. Others are worn from handling. Below them, index cards filled with scribbled dates, cross-referenced names, half-legible addresses. In the corner, a corkboard leans under the weight of clippings, newsprint yellowed and curling, held by rusted pins. One photo always sits in the center. The boy in the Kentucky letter. "Lewis?" written beneath it, barely visible now. On a nearby shelf, notebooks are stacked with tabs and colored sticky notes, each one labeled by year. She calls them volumes. She knows them better than her own reflection. It's not obsession. It's architecture, a map of memory, a blueprint for a question she refuses to let die. And while others may walk in and see madness, Sylvia sees a kind of order, the only kind that makes sense when the world gives you no answers. Lately, Sylvia has started receiving emails from people she's never met. College students, podcasters, amateur detectives. They find her through archived interviews or scattered mentions in forums. Some write essays. Others send blurry photographs. One girl, just 16, wrote a 5-page theory connecting the Sodder case to another missing child report from 1947. Sylvia reads every message. She doesn't always respond, but she never deletes them. She says it gives her hope, not that someone will solve it, but that people still care enough to try. One message stood out. A boy from Oregon wrote, "I know I can't give you answers, but I just want you to know. Your story made me call my grandmother for the first time in years." Sylvia printed it, folded it neatly, pinned it to her board beside a flyer from 1952. To her, this was as important as any document. Proof that the story hadn't died, that in some strange, quiet way, it was still saving people. Not in the way she expected, but maybe in the way it was meant to. One winter night, power went out in Sylvia's neighborhood. No lights, no hum of appliances, just cold silence. She lit a single candle and sat by the window, just like her mother once did. Snow fell in soft spirals outside, untouched, like time had paused. And in that stillness, Sylvia whispered all 5 names. Slowly, deliberately, like she was calling them home. She didn't expect a response, but she said them anyway, because names have weight, and forgetting is a second kind of death. Outside, the night remained quiet, but inside, something stirred. Not a sound or shadow, just a feeling. The kind you get when someone walks past you in a crowd, and you know you've met before. Maybe that's all she'll ever get. Flickers, fragments, a feeling in the dark. But for Sylvia, that's enough, because sometimes what's missing tells you more than what remains. And sometimes, the people who vanish leave behind more than the ones who stay. Every year, Sylvia marks the anniversary of the fire in the same quiet way. No flowers, no speeches, just a single candle placed on the mantel beneath the old family photo. She lights it at 12:30 a.m., the time the fire began, and lets it burn until dawn. She doesn't pray. She doesn't speak. She listens. Once, in her 40s, she tried holding a public vigil. She printed flyers, invited reporters, even rented folding chairs. Only a few people came. Some were kind, others just curious. After that, she stopped asking others to remember. She realized not everyone needs to carry the weight of ghosts. Some people are only meant to witness them, briefly, then move on. But for Sylvia, remembering isn't a burden. It's the last act of love she has left to give. And so the candle burns, every year, even if no one else sees it. In an old shoebox beneath her bed, Sylvia keeps a cassette recorder. It's dusty, worn, the kind with big clunky buttons and a faint hiss when it runs. On the tapes, her voice wavers, reading from newspaper clippings, describing dreams, whispering questions into the dark. Where did you go, Betty? Did someone take you? Did you try to come back? She started recording in the early 90s, when no one would listen anymore, when journalists stopped calling, when neighbors stopped asking, when even family started saying, "Let it go." But Sylvia didn't want to let it go. She wanted to store it, somewhere, even if just for herself, even if no one ever played them back. She once said, "If someday someone finds these tapes, I want them to hear that someone still cared, that someone still asked, because silence forgets. But voices, even fragile ones, echo." For years, Sylvia believed she remembered nothing from that night. No flames, no smoke, no screams, just darkness. But memory doesn't always speak in full sentences. Sometimes it surfaces in fragments, flashes that make no sense until you hold them against the right light. Like the way she flinches at the sound of glass breaking, or how the smell of burning pine makes her nauseous, or that recurring dream she had as a girl, of small hands pounding on a wall, muffled cries behind wood. She never told anyone about the dream, not even her mother, especially not her mother. It wasn't proof, it wasn't even reliable, but it felt real. And sometimes, she wonders, what if it wasn't a dream at all? What if that night left marks, not in her mind, but in her body, in her bones, her breath, her silence? Admission under her name the night of the fire. No emergency report, no burn treatment, not even a line in the local clinic's logbook. She was 2 years old. She had been pulled from a burning house. And yet, nothing. She asked her mother once, gently, "Did anyone take me to the hospital that night?" Her mother looked confused, then quiet. I thought they did," she said. "Your father held you. I assumed he took care of it." But nothing was ever confirmed. No one remembered. No one wrote it down. And somehow, a toddler survived a house fire without a single official record of her condition. It wasn't just odd. It was missing, like something had been scrubbed, or never recorded at all. Sometimes, late at night, Sylvia sits in the dark and imagines alternate timelines. Ones where the phone worked, where the ladder wasn't missing, where the fire trucks arrived on time, where 5 children grew up laughing in the backyard, instead of fading into myth. She doesn't believe in rewriting the past, but she believes in visiting it, touching it, holding it long enough to remember what it stole. There are no new clues, no fresh headlines, just the quiet persistence of a woman who refuses to let silence win. Maybe the truth is lost forever. Maybe the story will always be a wound that never closes. But Sylvia still lights the candle, still keeps the tapes, still speaks their names, because in a world that moves on so easily, she decided long ago that she wouldn't. Despite everything, George Sodder never gave up. As the years passed and his body grew weaker, his mind remained fixed on the same unshakable goal, finding out what happened to his children. In the 1960s, George quietly made several trips to Italy, chasing down whispers of distant relatives and vague leads that suggested the children may have been taken overseas. He visited family members Jenny hadn't spoken to in decades, hoping for a spark, any clue. But every meeting ended in silence and uncertainty. No one recognized the children from the photos. No one admitted to anything. George would return to West Virginia tired, more hollow each time. And yet, with every failed trip, his obsession only deepened. If they were alive, where were they now? One of the most haunting developments came in 1967, when Jenny received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, just a postmark from Kentucky. Inside was a single black and white photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back, someone had written in shaky script, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Elil boys, A90132 or 35. The man in the photo had deep eyes, a strong jawline, features eerily similar to Louis, the Sodder's missing son. George and Jenny were shaken. Was this real? A prank? Or a cruel trick played by someone who knew just enough to twist the knife? They sent private investigators to Kentucky, desperate for answers. But like so many leads before, it led nowhere. The man had vanished. No name, no trace, just another echo in a decades-long nightmare. As the years wore on, the Sodder home itself became a monument to the unanswered. Where the original house had burned stood a carefully tended garden, and above it, the now famous billboard. Jenny, always dressed in black, maintained the display religiously, changing out faded photographs, touching up peeling paint. It wasn't just a sign. It was her last weapon against silence. Passers-by would stop, read, sometimes cry. Some left notes. Others made phone calls. A few even claimed to have seen the children, working at gas stations, in distant towns, even in Canada. Most turned out to be mistaken identity or dead ends. But for the Sodders, every rumor carried hope. They had long since stopped expecting closure. Now they clung to something more fragile, the idea that someone, somewhere, still knew the truth. When George passed away in 1969, he still had a stack of newspaper clippings by his bedside, yellowed, folded, some stained with age. His children remembered him as a man both broken and defiant, someone who had spent decades chasing shadows but never stopped believing. After his death, Jenny took up the search alone. Though frail, she kept answering letters, reviewing new leads, and occasionally speaking to reporters who dared to ask. Over time, the billboard became more than a family plea. It evolved into a regional landmark. Travelers passing through Fayetteville would recognize it instantly. The 5 small faces, frozen in time, staring out above the scorched earth where their home once stood. A town's forgotten tragedy, or something darker preserved in plain sight. Jenny Sodder passed away in 1989, never knowing what truly happened to her 5 children. After her death, the billboard was finally taken down, its wooden frame cracked and weather-worn, the colors long faded. But by then, it had already done its work. The mystery of the Sodder children had transcended one family's grief and become something larger, a story passed between generations, whispered around campfires, and dissected in cold case circles. Theories still swirl. Was it a kidnapping orchestrated by someone they knew? Did the fire mask a darker crime? Or was it simply an unimaginable accident that grief refused to accept? No matter the answer, one truth remains. On a cold Christmas Eve in 1945, 5 children vanished without a trace, and the silence they left behind still echoes.